Today I want to talk a little bit about populism in Japan from a local government perspective, but also from the perspective of political geography. Both areas are my primary research interests. Now, about 3 years ago, I was given an opportunity to explain why there seems to be what has been referred to as populism, scare quotes all the time, at local level, but not at the national stage in Japan. So that's where my interest in populism in Japan started. And I wrote a chapter in a book very closely titled to this on the crisis of the international liberal order, which I'll talk about in a moment. I've also written an article with Professor Vogt, Gabby, as I always call her, I think I hope I pronounced that right, about Okinawan identity politics and how that represents a type of regional populism. Since then, I haven't really been actively working on populism in Japan, but I've had some future research ideas connecting it with the politics of urban-rural cleavage. In this talk, I will briefly explain the general interest and existing research on populism in Japan. I will also suggest some research challenges in addition to those which Axel has so effectively identified on his article on Reiwa Shinsengumi. I also want to explore what I think remains a major under-investigated puzzle. Why, unlike many other countries, there's so little rural or suburban populist backlash or just plain political backlash in Japan, either at national or local level. So we start here. We start with this data, which comes from the published chapter in 2019. This shows Google Trends results worldwide for the term populism in English and populism in Japanese. Even from such crude data, you can see how Japan is exceptional in terms of this populism phenomenon. For Japanese language, online searches peak in 2012, as you can see here. I guess I can use this laser pointer. And for the English, it peaks in 2017. Okay? Interest, at least online interest in searches. So this shows that interest in discussion, at least online, on populism in Japan existed several years before Brexit and the election of Trump in 2016, which sort of triggered a very sharp jump in searches. So what was being referred to as populism in the pre-Trump era in Japan? So here we can see the changing number of articles in Yomiuri and Asahi, including the term populism. Of the total, there are 1,700 articles. The term populism has been primarily used in reference to Prime Minister Koizumi and the snap election in 2005, DPJ and the manifesto in 2009, the victory of regional parties led by Osaka Governor Hashimoto in local election in 2011, and his launching of a national party, Ishin no Kai, by Hashimoto in 2012, Brexit and Trump from 2016 to 2017, and then the launching of Tokyo Governor Koike Yuriko's national party in 2017. There was a total of nearly 1,700 articles with the term populism in both newspapers. Among these articles, Japanese politicians most mentioned by order were these politicians: Hashimoto, 120 articles, Koizumi, Ishihara, Koike Yuriko, Kawamura. And then I also did an additional search because I know there's some fans out there of this politician, Yamamoto Taro, and there are 10. So you get a sense of how much interest there are. I mean, how the ranking of how Japanese politicians are, politicians referred as populists in their ranking. Now, besides this temporal gap between Japan and West, there's a perception analysis gap of populism between domestic observers and overseas observers of Japan. Some of the earliest academic works on populism focus on Koizumi and his populist style, once again, scare quotes, of politics. This is followed by the, scare quotes, populism of local executives like Ishihara, Tokyo Governor, Osaka Governor Hashimoto, and Mayor Kawamura, as you can see in these books quite early on, 2003, 2012. And Watanabe Tsuneo is the chairman of Yomiuri Shimbun. Very interesting. I haven't read this book yet. But in contrast, when Western observers at the height of populism hysteria, you can call it, following Brexit, Trump, and radical right surge in Western Europe, so 2016, 17, 18, looked to Japan, they found a country free of populism. Articles and op-eds in influential global media by the high priests of the liberal international order, I would call it, New York Times, Foreign Affairs, Financial Times, Economist, they pushed this narrative of Japan as being immune from populism. Japan was somehow free from the radical right and political turmoil as exemplified by Brexit and Trump, they argued. So these are articles. So you have probably heard all of the prime suspects or arguments put forth by these authors, and also myself in the article, to explain why Japan is immune of Western-style populism. They include the obvious, sort of seemingly obvious factors like a lack of immigration or relative lack of immigration, relative robust welfare state, low levels of inequality, relative, lack of cultural wars, I guess, LTB conservative dominance, so there's no backlash to liberal metropolitan values or policies, low levels of crime and insecurity, and perhaps maybe not so obvious, not so mentioned, high levels of education and lack of education gap, relative lack of education gap, geographic mobility for the frustrated in rural areas or so-called left behind areas, and et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of factors. Most of these are plausible and probably have some kind of causal impact on the reason why there isn't this Western-style populism in Japan. Although I'm not sure to date a very rigorous comparative analysis has been conducted, which includes Japan, that properly weighs the causal impact of these very interlinked and complex socioeconomic factors on Japanese voter attitudes and support for populist parties. So I'm not a quant scholar, but I don't think I've seen a kind of very comprehensive, systematic look at all these factors and how their causal weight, which somebody else might be able to do. This is not to say there isn't focused investigations which reveal specific aspects of Japanese populism, both on the demand side and supply side. These include findings such as, on the demand side, that supporters of Ishihara, Hashimoto, these local populist governors, have some so-called populist values such as nationalism, neoliberal attitudes, but the supporters are not necessarily the economic underclass or economically frustrated, or that populist values and support can't explain support for Hashimoto and Osaka referendum, or Koike, the articles by Zenkyo sensei and others. Or we're looking on the supply side, Japanese populists are populists in terms of their political style and strategy, but they are not, if you look at their policy positions and statements, anti-liberal or anti-globalization or xenophobic, as we see in a lot of Western populists. There's also an analysis that Japanese populists are unique in that many of them are local executives. They tap into and they foment frustration against vested elites, and there are particular institutional features, which I'll talk about in a moment, which enable such local populists. And my little small contribution, I argued in my article that Japanese populists' support is very evanescent, even more compared to the Western populists. They're driven by kind of winds, fevers, floating voters, and not by long-term macro issues, which seem to be animating populists elsewhere. And finally, of course, Axel's article, very interesting, and I've learned a lot from it too, that these Japanese populists are not really populists at all, as understood in the West, and that scholars are applying mainstream definitions partially. I agree with that. I think that we need more systematic and comparative measurements of populism in Japan. But in a sense, I would also like to say, if I can turn my page here, that if you're open to the possibility of populism as a matter of degree, not a binary, it's populism or not populism, but it's more or less populist in different degrees, to which leaders, parties, voters are observed to profess certain worldviews or strategies or values, then we shouldn't write off Japanese leaders or parties or voters as not populist at all. There's certain elements of it. And going by an increasing hegemonic definition of populism, a combination of anti-elitism and anti-pluralism, some elements of Japanese politics, as observed and as indicated by these authors that I mentioned, including myself, they certainly exhibit a degree of populism, particularly supply-side strategy of anti-elitism and dividing the world into two homogeneous camps. Of course, comparative methodological problems remain. It is easy, first of all, to cherry-pick populist statements or manifesto claims or policy positions. And this seems to be a common fault in many of the qualitative studies on Japanese populism. There is a need for systematic comparisons of so-called populist and non-populist categories of parties or leaders or voters. And few studies on Japanese populism has really done that or met this standard. I think Zenkyo's article in Party Politics does this most consciously, to do it comparatively using sort of Western definitions, but it's only limited to 2017 Tokyo election. So we need to have a broader approach. Over time comparisons could be done too. It could be possible that the progressive governors in the 60s and 70s, their policy positions or their discourse, their attitudes maybe even more populist than the governors that we talk about today. Okay, let's go on. Since Gabby is here, hi Gabby, I'm going to mention this, and of course this is one of the articles I wrote about populism. Why we thought that Okinawan case could be called regional populism. In a sense, my research with Professor Vogt will try to achieve this kind of comparative approach over time, imperfectly and maybe not so explicitly. We looked at whether anti-elite us versus them worldview existed and how that changed in Okinawan politics since reversion in 1971. And we found increases in references to words and phrases relating to Okinawan identity in gubernatorial campaigns, speeches, assemblies, local media. And compared to past governors' rhetoric, Governor Onaga's languages, we found clearly more populist. He divides the world into two largely monolithic camps, the virtuous and discriminated Okinawans against a discriminatory and indifferent central government. Thus, we concluded all Okinawa movement as a regional populism, regionalist populism. They mobilize and unify, it's a discourse that mobilizes and unify the Okinawan public on regional identity against a monolithic Tokyo government and monolithic elite parties. But obviously, Onaga and his all Okinawan movement are not anti-pluralist, anti-liberal, xenophobic, unlike, say, typical regionalist populist movements such as the Italian Lega Nord or Belgian Vlaams Belang. There are other regionalist parties out there, the SNP, for example, Scottish National Party. I don't know how many people have described as populist, but certainly more on the left-leaning inclusive side. In any case, Onaga and his successors envision Okinawa to become an island of tourism open to the world, serving as a bridge connecting conflicting regions to Asia. So there's none of that xenophobic kind of quality to it. More of similar to Western populist radical right mode, I think, in the Okinawan case, are those opposed to Onaga. The racist kind of xenophobic conspiratorial mode you can find a lot in the far right net activists, Netto Uyoku. They're very critical of Onaga, and there's a lot of conspiracy theories going so far as to accuse Onaga as a Chinese spy, as you can see in this very, very graphic photo, poster uploaded to a far-right blog. Okay, good, we're in time, I hope. So to summarize so far, there is a perception and scholarship on Japanese and Western populism. Very different. There's a gap timing-wise in the interest and the way it's defined and the kind of even the actual populists themselves, how they are. Japanese populism is seen primarily as a strategy style of anti-elitism, but Japanese populism lacking in other elements, anti-pluralism, xenophobia, anti-globalism, for various reasons. It's unique socioeconomic, cultural, historical context. But there remains one puzzle, I think, that is under-investigated. And one is that these populist revolts or insurgencies in Japan, challengers, they're local. Much of it is local, and they're successful local, but they're very much rural, right? Why are these so-called populist revolts largely urban, not rural? It's very puzzling when in the West, populist backlash from rural, suburban, left behind areas is understood to be a vital source of populist support. So before I go on to engage with this puzzle, just in this very short slide, I want to explain why there has been more populist revolts in local elections in Japan, rather than at the national level. For more explanation, you can read my book chapter or an article by Professor Yoshida, who I think already gave you a lecture. Maybe you talked about this. One are the institutional features of local government in Japan. It's easier and cheaper and faster to capture a local office in Japan because it's mayoral, governorial. It's a one-shot game to become governor mayor compared to capturing the legislature. It's much more easier to come as an outsider, presidential elections as well, as a populist. Another institutional feature is that local elections are maybe treated as second-order events or elections. They're less at stake, so voters are willing to experiment with alternatives, including these type of populist or anti-mainstream challengers. And governors, mayors, as chief executives provide one-person leadership. They're unhindered by party organizations or interest groups, or less hindered, and this allows for direct and unfiltered ties to voters. And that kind of facilitates a populist style. Now, the ideational feature, which I would like to emphasize, especially when when I was talking about Okinawa is that unlike national elections or national parties or campaigns, local politicians can tap into regionalist sentiment that goes against the mainstream nationwide parties. The successful populist insurgencies in Osaka, Okinawa, Nagoya, the discourse all to some extent emphasized decentralization and local parties and local solutions against kind of monolithic mainstream parties that don't have the right answer for the local community. Okay, so we covered that. But as many have observed, there have been many local anti-stream party revolts. They're not local in the sense of being rural. The word chiho doesn't apply here in terms of the ruralness. With a few exceptions, regional parties led by local governors are all urban-based, right? Tokyo First, obviously, Okinawa, Osaka Ishin no Kai, Nagoya Genzei Nippon. Maybe Kada-san and Shiga's Taiwan no Kai is a kind of exception, but it's a very short-lived exception, even more short-lived than these others. The new national parties that have been described as populist, like Reiwa and NHK から自国民を守ると lack suburban rural presence or policy emphasis as well. All share, apart from Reiwa, maybe NHK, neoliberal emphasis on deregulation, cutting, wasteful spending, decentralization to drive competition, not using government or big government intervention to level out regional inequalities. So in Japan, there seems to be politics of leaving behind past inefficiencies, past redistributive methods, including support for rural areas. And there isn't the kind of politics of the left behind lashing out at elites in the metropole. All right. Here's some data that I sort of prepared for this lecture. It's very crude. We see that many of the parties that have been described as populist, they have very much urban presence in terms of their candidacies for national elections and their winners as well. HIJINO, Reiwa, NHK, Party of Hope. I won't go into so much detail. You can look at it later in the recording. One thing that I found very interesting was that Reiwa has very little. They don't stand any local candidates as opposed to NHK, right? Who are more active in local elections. Of course, they're still active in urban areas. This percentage says of the candidates or of the winners, how many of them come from urban prefectures using this DID. But the difference here is quite interesting. It's a kind of mini puzzle if you're interested in pursuing this, why Reiwa doesn't go for local elections, whereas NHK seems to go for local elections. But in any case, a very urban phenomenon. Whereas in contrast, urbanness in the West, recent studies of populism in the West have suggested that rural, suburban, and peripheral areas tend to be more prone to the influence of populism. And here there are many examples: Trump and Tea Party. Outside of the rich cities, Brexit supporters are stronger in areas experiencing relative economic decline, suburban, urban areas left behind cities, and also rural areas. French farmers supporting Marine Le Pen. Gilets jaunes is a very anti-Paris kind of movement, and so on and so forth. And you can see this in the maps, left behind areas, places that don't matter, so Rust Belt or flyover country. In many of these areas, they provide fertile ground for populist parties and leaders, right? And of course, I kind of jumped over it, but the original term populism has a very much strong rural agrarian base. The People's Party in the US, the Russian Narodniks, this is just Wikipedia information, but they very much were primarily engaged in the peasantry kind of agrarian socialism against the metropole cities. So what about Japan? Another 10 minutes. Kaso and Kamitsu, as you know, is very old. The left behind peripheral areas is an old and substantial theme in Japanese politics. The words for concentration in cities and depopulation in rural areas, kaso and kamitsu, has been around for more than half a century, actually. Earliest books from 1970s using this title. And in 1972, of course, Prime Minister Takakue, he announced the need to balance the development of the Japanese state and reduce the gap between urban and rural Japan in this famous book, Nihon Retto Kaizoron. But of course, industrialization, post-industrialization, globalization pressures in the past 50 years has been very strong, and rural depopulation over concentration in cities has continued very much, as you can see here in this graph. Depopulation of Tokyo, non-Tokyo, and increased population influx into Tokyo has continued since 2000. Of course, the inflow into Tokyo has reversed due to COVID last year, but it's unclear that this will be a lasting trend. You can also find Japan as an outlier in terms of the portion of its population that is concentrated in the metropolitan area, right? Tokyo metropolitan area, the 3 prefectures and Tokyo outlying prefectures has 30% of the national population, much higher apart from Seoul and most countries, and including in Europe. And Japan is also very much over-concentrated economically in Tokyo. You can see here OECD data, Japan's metropolitan area contributes what? The amount of GDP here is about 30-40%, very high, just with Tokyo, 30-40%. Okay, and also there's not just the demographic and economic concentration, there's kind of depopulation is going on in rural areas, as we all know. And despite rural areas aging and depopulating faster, they have higher fertility rates than the major cities, right? Cities, especially Tokyo, is drawing in a population like a demographic black hole. In other words, rural areas generate babies and raise them while cities suck them in. So one would imagine, I imagine, that this kind of dynamic should feed a kind of resentment for those older voters or parents, grandparents left behind in cities, or perhaps makes them feel more connected to cities since their children and relatives are there. So maybe that divides the urban rural gap, not quite sure. And there's also a sense of crisis that these left behind regions might vanish. Think tanks predict that by 2040, about half of Japan's municipalities will vanish, risk of vanishing. And how about economic inequality? Here we can see that regional income inequality has been increasing since 2000. Though having fallen from peak in the bubble era in 1980s to 90s, it's fallen. It started to pick up since, of course, Koizumi administration, Abe administration, fell a little bit during Lehman shock and DPJ. I calculated this from the Gini coefficient for all of Japan's municipalities from 1975 to 2019 here, as you can see, and it has been going up. Well, moderately, but still going up. More important than the actual amount of growing inequality, I think, are the perceptions. This is one of my favorite graphs here. It shows that more and more voters believe regional inequality is worsening. So this is from a survey from the Naikaku survey asking voters about certain social issues, whether they're getting better or worse. And you can see that there's a very sharp increase in people believing that regional inequality is increasing. Very few say it's improving. It's worsening. So this is very strong. And this is one of the major, they asked many different areas, and this is one of the highest policy areas that people believe are worsening. In addition, in another cabinet survey, 20% of Japanese voters believe government should do something about regional inequality. Right? The different topics: revitalizing regions, administrative reform, promoting decentralization, deregulation, revitalizing regions, doing something about regional inequality, about left behind areas, is high on priorities of Japanese public. So there's both a sense of crisis about regional inequality and a desire that something must be done about it. But then there isn't the kind of political backlash in Japan. Why? One explanation may be by looking at Japan comparatively with other countries. If we compare regional inequality in Japan compared to other OECD countries, it is clear Japan is among the more equal countries. Right? This shows gaps between the top income 20% and poorest 20%, and the ratio, Japan is very low. So maybe that's one reason, and there hasn't been such a big jump compared to 2016 to 2000, the last 15 years. But then, of course, if you look at US or Spain or Sweden or Finland, they have similar levels of regional inequality, not so much more higher than Japan, but you've had very clear rural, semi-rural populist backlash in these countries. So either the data is not capturing regional inequality properly, or it is not really the absolute level inequality that is necessary or sufficient for populist revolt from the periphery. Now, if you look to Japan, I just have another few more slides, so bear with me. So I'm going through this very quickly. On the demand side, one can look at the nature of rural voters. Studies have found that the longer you stay in one place, length of continued residence in one area is positively correlated to support for the LDP and vice versa. Right? Amada's study. Others have found that city residents are more active in creating new networks, less inclined to feelings of impotence and social isolation, as well as have more pluralistic viewpoint. So this means rural voters are older, conservative, unwilling to challenge authority. They're prepared to continue to support conservative LDP despite ongoing material and demographic decline. So this might be one reason. And of course, there's a lack of conservative backlash because conservatives are semi-perennially in power, and when they were out during, or when they don't listen to and pay attention to rural interests during the Koizumi period, Takenaka period, there was a backlash. You can see between 2007 and the DPJ. Supply side explanations, or this is much more descriptions, but there appears to be far fewer political entrepreneurs, governors especially from less wealthy urban regions, so less wealthy rural areas, that is, willing to challenge the center. A lack of non-mainstream challengers in rural, semi-rural prefectures of Japan may be, as people argue, a result of these regions' continued dependency on subsidies and fundings from the center. And you can see this from the proportion of former bureaucrat governors, which has actually increased recently. Currently 59%, I think 28 out of 47 governors are former bureaucrats, as opposed to in the past. Of course, it was high in the past, but it's increased. This suggests that there's even more conservatism in the politics of rural Japan. These governors continue to appeal to voters, saying that they're going to be a pipeline to the center, be able to draw out subsidies. And of course, the rural dominance of the LDP, traditionally in rural areas, continues, and it makes it very difficult for challengers, non-LDP challengers, to stand as candidates and to win gubernatorial elections. In fact, this is part of another project I'm doing, but rural areas, semi-rural areas, are even more dominated by the LDP since 1994 if you look at different indicators. You see here the map, the average seats share of all SMDs in each prefecture, so pre-1994, post-1994, after electoral reform, and you see that the darker colors are those where the LDP is stronger, and there are more prefectures in which the LDP dominates the SMDs and seats in the prefecture. Actually, since 1994, the number of prefectures in which the LDP captures all seats, 100%, goes from 0 to 28%, right? And in some prefectures like Shimane and Fukui, the LDP has not lost a single SMD to an opposition party over the past 25 years. So these are very, very strong strongholds. There's some other indicators that you can look at, showing that the rural areas have become ever more dominated. Certain rural areas have become ever more dominated by the LDP, and opposition parties and challengers have a very difficult time entering in. And so these prefectures basically are being taken for granted, but declining, you see. So there's what I believe should be some kind of backlash coming at some point, but we don't see it at all. So if we were to continue this research, how should we go about doing this? Well, on the demand side, one wants to use surveys to know when and why voters in left behind Japan will vote or have voted against the LDP, right? And on the supply side, one wants to know how the new parties debate, or old parties, even opposition parties, debate and frame the urban-rural cleavage nationally and in local campaigns. The media discourse on regional equality, how that's changing, and how opposition parties as well as gubernatorial candidates are trying to challenge incumbents in these left-behind areas that are overwhelmingly still dominated by the LDP. Two more slides. And I have a suggestion. I don't know. I was thinking I wanted to do this before the pandemic struck, but I've kind of become stuck, not leaving for outside of Kyoto or my home for research. But potential case study of Rust Belt Japan. So far as I know, there isn't so much political reportage or academic analysis of the impact of kudoka, or the hollowing out of industry, on political behaviors and attitudes. I think Kitakyushu City, Kitakyushu is a prime example of, if you're going to call it Rust Belt Japan, as a major steel manufacturing heart of Japan, facing decades of decline and closures over now 30, 40 years of closing steel mills and industry. It has the steepest decline in population in 2019. There's relatively high levels of crime, foreign residents. And yet the LDP has continues to dominate the Fukuoka 9th and 10th district. The LDP has won every single election since 2012, 1996. And another wonderful anecdote from this region, one of the reasons why I wanted this as case study, is that the leader of the SEALs movement, Okadaki SEALs, if you remember, were the young students who protested against Abe and his secrecy law and collective security law about 4 or 5 years ago. And then the leader of Japan First, nationalist right-wing girl, Sakurai Makoto, they're both born and brought up in Kitakyushu. So is this a coincidence? I don't know. But in any way, it's a great way to start a story about Left Behind Japan, the politics of Left Behind Japan. Okay, final slide. So places that are non-competitive and taken for granted, at least outside of Japan, have kind of backlash, just led to critical backlash and resulted in political system reconfiguration in recent years. But we don't see that in Japan, although Japan has one of the most long-held strongholds with politics not changing, and yet you see also steady demographic and economic decline. And as the surveys that I showed you, voters are strongly concerned about it. It's an issue in their minds. Corona, I haven't really talked about it. You need to consider the impact of Corona on the politics of rural-urban cleavage, probably, but all of this is just mere speculation. There's been a halt to the inflow of the population into Tokyo, but this is probably temporary, as long as the sort of structural gap between the wages and education and job opportunities remain between Tokyo and the rest of Japan. Has the pandemic had a greater health and economic impact in urban areas than rural areas? Probably. Infection rates, death rates, job losses suggest that pandemic hit urban Japan more than rural Japan. So does this mean less envy for cities, less need to diffuse any kind of potential backlash, rural-urban backlash? I don't know. It's an interesting question. In any case, in Japan, there's really been no anti-vax, anti-mask, anti-science populism, which is another notable case of how anomalous Japan is. There's no anti-lockdown riots, as we're seeing in Holland, I guess, in Germany as well. So upcoming general election is going to be very interesting, I think, to give us a better indication about the impact of Corona in general, but also what's going to happen to the future of Left Behind Japan. But in the long run, regardless of whether it's going to be a new LDP administration or non-LDP administration, they'll have to deal with this urban-rural cleavage, and it won't go away with or without populist backlashes.